there's a couple of big moments along this journey. And the first one is the buy-in. And I think we have seen, even from an organizational standpoint, that those high-level leaders lead the way. Getting those high-level leaders to buy in is really key because they open the door. But we've had people who are like, yeah, I'll do it. And they don't buy in and they don't get to see the results. They don't get to see the change happening. And then you have people that from the beginning are just committed.
Sometimes the most important thing is simply to commit. I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast, a production of the People Forward Network. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. So we just completed our 3-part summer series called Who Not What From Research to Application. Or did we actually complete it? Because today we actually have a bonus episode that goes along with our summer series. And in this bonus episode, you're going to get to hear from Sara Turner. Sara sits in a very unique position. She's the Director of Client Support for us here at the Aperio. What that means is that she gets a backstage pass to watch individuals and organizations pursue who-based leadership development. She gets to see the struggles and the strains. She gets to hear the stories of failure and success. She gets to see progress happen in its rawest form over a long period of time. With all of that incredible perspective, she's going to join us on the podcast to talk about what she sees as critical factors for success and failure in leadership development based on the development of who we are. So let's get to this bonus episode of our summer series, Who Not What From Research to Application with Sara Turner. Let's talk about positive leaders who've made an impact for you personally.
What's really interesting this morning as I was thinking about this, nothing really quickly came to mind. And I was a little bit alarmed by that. I thought, man, that's not great. But I think what it led me to realize is the absence of good leaders affect you. And so I was able to pull one out. And it was when I was a teacher, the middle school principal, who was my boss, was just a fantastic leader. And so I thought about what made him a great leader, and it was his care for us as his teachers and the care he had for his students. He was just a loving, warm guy. And as a teacher on his staff, I knew that he would back me up, especially when it came to parents or issues. But he wouldn't just always let me slide. Like, he would hold me accountable. And of course, the people pleaser that I am, I was always scared. He had something to talk to me about. But it was really good because that made me a better person. It made me a better teacher. But he'd be the one who would hold you if you were crying. So just the care that he had as a boss. And I remember when I first started working with him, I didn't know his style of communication. And so I felt like I was always walking on eggshells. And I just at one point went to him and I said, can you just talk to me about your leadership style so that I can feel like I can relate to you in a very real way? And he did that. And it was really important for our relationship, that open communication.
What did he say?
So it really shows my lack of being secure and settled. But I said, if I don't have feedback, I interpret that as I'm doing something wrong. And so he was able to respond with, I will tell you if something's going on or if there's something you need to modify or change. So it was, I think that knowing his communication style and his being clear about that really helped me to understand his feedback.
So in that regard, it's really interesting because what he did in that moment is he attempted, the way I hear that story, to influence essentially your worldview, the way you looked at things. You're saying, essentially, if you don't tell me that I'm doing a good job, then I'm going to assume that I'm not doing a good job. And he said, I promise you, I will tell you if you're not doing a good job. It's interesting because we think about leaders who care and leaders who serve, but in that moment, he didn't go along with the program that you were offering. He didn't say, okay, stop by my office at 8:03 every day. I'm going to tell you how great you are. And that's an exaggeration. Now, I'm guessing that, let me just go ahead and insert the name here, Steve. I'm guessing that Steve probably was complimentary of you, right?
Yes, he always gave good feedback. So it was really my insecurity that I was fishing for, and he didn't, like you said, he didn't buy into my dysfunctional program. And that's what a good leader does, right? He led me in that moment into a better way of existing in the school and a better way of being an employee. So I was able to grow in that moment.
From a technical standpoint, as an administrator, as a school administrator who's responsible for teachers doing all the things the teachers need to do, from being great at their craft to handling discipline and all of that. So talk a little bit about, because somebody could hear like, okay, great. He said nice things to you and he was positive and he was encouraging and he pushed you a little bit, but on the non-relational side of things, do you look at him and think that he's an expert school administrator?
Absolutely. I think he had this unique combination of experience, but also, we talk about who he was as a person and his ability to be others focused and inwardly sound. You have to be those as a middle school administrator of a private school and still have some level of influence. But he had so much knowledge. And what I think was really amazing is that I was a new teacher and he didn't get impatient. He didn't get weary of coaching me because I did need a lot of coaching. I just knew that what he was sharing with me was tried and true, but it wasn't like a tip and trick just to win the short game. It was really about moving the vision forward of the school and honoring God. And really good leaders that we remember, they're often these amazing who's, but it's not like that cancels out the what they did. I think it just goes, the who goes ahead. Good leaders, I think, have the who and the what.
If the most junior person in the school comes up with a great idea, if I'm secure in who I am as a human being, I don't have to be the person with all the answers and all the ideas. And if I have humility, I'm able to listen to really anybody. It doesn't need to be about me. And so when you combine those two things, what they actually do is they open us up to be better at all aspects of technicalities and skills and what of leadership, because those who-based things are not getting in the way. And so there's a relationship between who and what, in that my what has a chance to grow and get better because of who I show up as. Now just look at that, and you just play that story over and over and over again for a couple of decades, and all of a sudden I have advantages on the technical side of what I'm doing as a school administrator that others who don't show up with humility and being secure and settled, they're not going to have those advantages, because all of that information coming from any place that it might show up from is not as available to me because I've cut myself off from it because of who I am. And a more well-developed who ultimately over the long run becomes a more effective what leader because of the relationship between the two.
Yeah, and I think that's a misconception as people come to know or experience the who, not what principle, and they hear about it. I think their first obstacle is they think it's an either or. They think if I'm pursuing who development, it means the what is falling by the wayside. And I think what we're always saying is that's absolutely not true. It's not who or what. It's the who makes the what possible. You're not sacrificing this aspect of leadership by pursuing who development. You're actually enhancing this development over here by pursuing who development.
That's really well said. It reminds me of times when we have been talking with clients or prospective clients who are knee-deep in very necessary what-based programs and initiatives internally. And when we get the opportunity to talk about, okay, let's talk about how a more well-developed base of who-based leaders in the organization are going to make those programs and those initiatives more effective over the long run.
Makes me think of, in our last episode, Dom talked about the morning you gathered for a development session and the kiln had broken, and how the company leaders had to confront, we have this huge problem over here. that we need our what skills, our technical skills to figure out, yet we're sitting in this room prioritizing who development. And I think that's just an example of what you're saying, that this was a company and this was a set of leaders that said, we say this all the time. This is a Timism, is the important but not urgent. We have to always talk about prioritizing the important but not urgent.
You mentioned Dom, who we spoke with in our last episode. And you sit in, I mean, really, it's like a one-of-a-kind position in terms of what you get to see from leaders and from organizations who are walking this who-based path. From where you sit, what is it that causes somebody to be successful in going down this who-based development path?
I think it was really good, sort of, like you said, sitting in the seat that I'm at and then hearing Dom's language to it, because it made a lot of, immediately I could see the trends. But I think the biggest thing is people are committed to the work. The people that find it fruitful, are seeing how it's helping them and light bulbs are going on and they're seeing change and movement, are people that are just committed to it. And I think it was Dom who said, you need to want to do it. You need to just be willing. There's a couple of big moments along this journey. And the first one is the buy-in. And I think we have seen, even from an organizational standpoint, that those high-level leaders lead the way. Getting those high-level leaders to buy in is really key because they open the door. But we've had people who are like, yeah, I'll do it, and they don't buy in, and they don't get to see the results. They don't get to see the change happening. And then you have people that from the beginning are just committed. And this is what's interesting. They start seeing these small wins because we have them constantly reflecting. And that reflection piece is so important because then they're sitting and seeing in real time these changes happening. And I think once a participant sees the win, it brings about more intrinsic motivation. And so then they're like, oh, I saw this happen at work, or I saw this happen at home. And well, man, I'm going to keep going now, even though it's hard. So just that willingness, and that takes, I think, a lot of discipline because the journey requires that. It requires commitment. And we talk about the secret sauce of the Aperio method is this depth, community, and time. And so that is the space or the context that we create. And then as a participant buys into that, we help with the accountability, right? We help with cheering on and encouraging, but it really hinges on their ability to go deep, to really look at themselves and to be willing to look in the mirror, their willingness to engage in community and to be held accountable, and their willingness to put in the time. And that's after that, that's where the magic happens for sure.
As you say that, I'm reminded of some things that we have seen with various executive teams. I'm thinking of one in particular right now where, yes, the ideal scenario is that the top leader is committed and bought in and disciplined, but I'm thinking of one that wasn't. And it had a profound depressive impact on the team. However, there were still individuals on that executive team who really understood what the research said and really saw the opportunity to grow and develop in who they were and really threw themselves into the work. And they grew and developed in their leadership effectiveness without the benefit of having the most senior leader be somebody who was right there with them. So, yeah, that makes a harder path. But even in that harder path, if you decide, nobody's going to stop you. Unless somebody think that this is a commercial, like it doesn't matter whether you're working with the Aperio or any other who-based development. If you decide that you're going to be committed to it, nobody can really stop you.
It's not going to get wasted. It's going to have a resounding effect on whatever spheres of influence you're in.
That's an interesting comment. To your point, like you are becoming a more effective leader, whether they're going to pay attention to you or to that or to your effort or not, that effort will not be in vain. You will become a more effective leader. And then what happens? Your team benefits from that. Your team at home, as it were, the people you're influencing in your family, they're going to benefit from that. And ultimately, because of how things come around, you benefit from that as well.
Yeah. And I think that's positive and encouraging for people who may feel like they're in companies. What do you do if you hear this message and you think, oh, this is great, but my company would never? You still have tremendous power and influence in your hands to affect your life and your immediate surroundings.
All right. You mentioned the word reflection, and we do, with the leaders that we have the privilege of working for, we do set up a fair amount of personal reflection. And we get a chance to have a window into those reflections through a regular process that we call codification. And you get a chance to see in writing people who are on this who-based path. So I wonder, of course, anonymously to maintain privacy, are there a couple of stories that you have seen over the years that stand out to you as an example of, oh, wow, look at the progress that somebody made in who they are and look at the impact that that had?
There's so many, and I think as I get to be a fly on the wall sometimes, I'm just grinning from ear to ear when people just have these big moments or they get it. And sometimes it's the small moments that open up into these big moments. We had a client who was working through becoming more agapone. And agapone is a part of others focused. It's a service to and care for others that is selfless, consistent, and unconditional. And I really, really love seeing our clients work with agapone and seeing what happens as that they engage in the practice of looking towards others. And this one particular client, she had this aha moment because she realized, oh, this is not a one size fits all. It's not that every single one of my team have the same kind of needs or wants. So one of the things she did was set up specific blocks of time where she could sit down with members of her team simply with the goal of hearing what they needed. And for her, that was a sacrifice, because one of the things we talk about in agapone is it requires the sacrifice of the leader. And so she had to make a commitment to sacrifice her time to essentially set up these blocks of time that were completely in service of her team. And she saw all these ripple effects. Not only did her team members open up and respond and feel appreciated and loved and cared for, but it actually turned into more effective business because she was in the loop on where they were personally, where they were professionally, and they were able to solve problems more easily, and they were able to be more effective in their time management. So where she could have thought, this is costing me time, it actually bought her time. And this is another example of the who opening the way for the what. Her becoming a more agapone leader opened the way for what they were doing as a business to be more effective.
I remember that story that you're referring to, and one of the things that was really striking about it is that if you just go at face value, her action, as she was working to be more agapone, was ultimately to add 4 hours of meetings to her work week every week. And nobody's got that. So she's behaving and thinking sacrificially. Now, this wouldn't be true for everybody who's listening, but this was true for her. When she took the step to add those meetings into her already completely full schedule, one of the amazing things that happened is that she found that she was working less at night and less on the weekend because she was enabling her team to be more effective, so that in the long run, it was actually saving her significant time and energy. She truly was, and this is the right word, she was truly making an investment. Think about that word. The word investment means that there is a return that is going to come over here. There's a relationship between what I'm doing now and a bigger capability, a bigger capacity down the road. And the thing is, if you're purely doing the math on that, then it loses its punch because it's just complex self-interest, I guess. If you say, look, I'm just going to do A so that I get B for myself. But she didn't approach it that way. She said, I'm going to do A because it is in service to the team. And while she may have hoped that it would pay off, she certainly didn't know that her weekends were going to free up and her nights were going to free up as well. And That's not only good for her, it's better for just, you can go burnout, long-term leadership, all of that kind of stuff. So that is a great example of how who-based development shows up and makes the what more effective for a boatload of people, not just one person. Are there any other stories along those lines that you want to tell? Because you have read hundreds of these codifications over the years.
I really enjoy seeing different kind of leaders interact with this work. So you sometimes have these very high senior level leaders, and sometimes you have more frontline or middle manager. And I love seeing them interact with the same material in their own unique context and what that looks like. And it looks really different depending on the kind of work that you do. So we have another participant who is basically a part of a leadership group in their company, and they represent sort of their position on a committee. So he was serving on this committee, and he had to show up and facilitate one of their group meetings. And after he left that meeting, he got some really negative feedback from someone high up who was not present at the meeting. And it really caught him off guard, and it really took the legs out from underneath him. It was very discouraging. But we had been working on Emotionally Mature. And so he knew that he shouldn't react in that moment. So he took a step back. He didn't react. And what I also loved is he called up members of his small group. And he said, basically, I need your encouragement. Help me find perspective, because I am emotionally charged. And I am learning that I need to take a step back, and I need to emotionally calm down so that I can handle this situation correctly. So I loved that aspect of it, because that's the community piece where people on the journey with him who know the language were able to say, okay, this is what you need to do. And so he re-engaged the situation from a very calm place. One of the things we talk about in Emotionally Mature is recognizing and responding to my emotions and the emotions of others in ways that increase energy, connection, influence, and information. And so he ended up re-engaging with this leader in a calm way. He was able to share some of the changes that he felt were necessary in these committee meetings. And in the next committee meeting, employed those and said it was the best meeting that they had ever had. What he could have done is, if he wasn't practicing being emotionally mature, blow his top to his superior. Think about what that would have caused, the lack of connection, how he would have lost influence. But instead, him becoming more emotionally mature led to these positive repercussions for his relationship with his superior, his relationship with his small group, and also his ability to influence the rest of that committee and that committee group.
As you're sharing these stories, I'm reminded of a frontline leader story that we had a number of years ago. And there was a shift supervisor that saw a couple of workers off to the side doing an activity with a piece of equipment that he wasn't familiar with. And he paused and asked a few questions, because we were working on the idea of being others-focused curious. So he said, okay, I'm going to apply what we're working on. And what he learned in that pause is that there was a special piece of equipment that needed to be ordered. And if it had been on site, then these gentlemen would not be working in such difficult circumstances outside in the cold. This could all go much faster and much more effectively. So he took that information, he took it up the chain of command. They found the money, they bought the piece of equipment. And there's a couple parts of this story that just still stick with me today. He made a really interesting comment after sharing the whole story, because he goes back to them, and of course they get the new piece of equipment. He talks about what happened in terms of their observable engagement in the business as a result of this interaction that resulted. Yes, they got the piece of equipment, but that wasn't the end of the story. That was really the beginning of the story, because now these two employees understood what they're going to be listened to and paid attention to. So now he responds with, I have much more engaged employees. And there are over 300 studies worldwide that talk about the connection between engagement and performance. So that's not a small thing. Now, the kicker of this entire story is when it happened. It's my favorite part of this story, because that shift supervisor was leaving the plant when this happened. He was on his way out at 2:00 in the morning. And when you think about the overarching idea, we were specifically working on being curious, but that is under the umbrella of being others focused. I don't know about you, but if I'm finishing the shift at 2 a.m., I got one thing on my mind, and that is getting home and getting to bed. And the idea that he applied that curiosity under those circumstances at that time really speaks to him understanding not only being curious, but the bigger picture that we were working on, this bigger idea of being others focused. So I love how everybody wins in these stories. But back to what we talked about at the beginning, it does take diligence. It does take commitment. It does take effort. This is all the long game, but I love it when the short-term wins show up so people can be encouraged to continue on that path.
Maybe you could share a little bit about, from the organizational side, what makes a company successful in actually taking on who-based development, and why don't more companies do it?
I think there are a couple things, and we've mentioned one of them earlier when we said, okay, maybe my top leader isn't bought into this type of development. And we are making the case to say, well, nobody can stop you if you really want it. But it is a heck of a lot easier when you have a senior leader that is on board. So that's one of the things I would say. The most successful organizations who take this on broadly have the most influential people in the room are supportive. But I think there's one thing that's even bigger than that, and that is being willing to be in these conversations. So many organizations are afraid of who-based conversations. They'd rather talk about skills or more comfortable things like strategy. And frankly, strategy is fun and it's interesting, but when we pursue strategy and we ignore who's leading the strategy, ultimately it gets back to what the research says, where at that point we're focusing on what is part of, not even fully, part of 23% of leadership. And so one of my favorite things to say to leaders who are either on this path or considering this path is, if you want world-class leadership development, you have to be willing to have world-class conversations about leadership. And you simply cannot have world-class conversations about leadership if you're excluding the deeper issues of who. If you're excluding talking about things that make somebody inwardly sound and others focused, then you are, by definition, by research, excluding 77% of leadership. So the organizations who are willing to engage in dialogue around things like curiosity and empathy, we talk about being secure and settled and purposeful and principled and so many other things that are part of being inwardly sound and others focused. Those are the organizations that over the long haul, they're going to win because they're willing to be in those conversations that line up with research, that line up, frankly, with common sense, that line up even with their personal experiences. But even though it lines up with all three of those things, it doesn't line up with traditional leadership discussions, especially in the for-profit world.
So you've talked about the things that make these companies successful and what helps them buy into the who, not what principle, and also, this anecdotal evidence. We're talking about the things that they can see. Could you share with us some of the actual numbers that support those stories?
The anecdotal stories are fun, but I think for those of us who like the research world, we're painfully aware that that's a story. That's a example. And so the trends overall become important, and that's one of the things that we can go to numbers for. What comes to mind is an organization who really engaged with who-based development at a variety of levels in the organization. And quite fortuitously, when we started working with them, they began doing measurement with McKinsey's Organizational Health Index. And OHI has a number of implications for it regarding financial performance. And unfortunately for this client that we were beginning to work with, they discovered at the very beginning that they were in the bottom quartile of OHI scores globally. They were at 59. And so they were alarmed by that. They were not happy by that. And they took on a number of initiatives to improve that. At that same time, they began who-based leadership development with many of their senior leaders, and later took that to some middle management leaders, and later on took that to a handful of frontline leaders. And so over the course of 5 years, their OHI score improved from 59 to 72. That's a 22% increase in OHI over 5 years. And that landed them in the top quartile of OHI, which has a number of very positive financial implications. So it's one thing for us to talk about the stories. And I like talking about the stories because it gives life and example. But when somebody says, yeah, well, show me the data, show me the money, we're able to say, hey, look, when an organization takes on who-based development, over time, it has a significant positive impact that eventually hits the bottom line of the organization.
It's so interesting because with all that's been happening in the workplace, in an organizational culture, we have this unique experience of sort of seeing all these things happening. And every time I see some crazy new thing happening in the workforce, I think, man, leaders are so important right now. And leaders who are pursuing who-based development are going to be on the front end of all of these trends because they are listening to their people. Even what's happening now with people wanting to unionize. They've never had so many people, like this resurgence in people being interested in unions. And I think, well, it's because employees want a voice, but good leaders give their people a voice. And so when I think about the companies and the clients who we're working with right now, I think the good things we're going to see spring up, not only in the moment for each individual person on the journey, but years from now, I just feel so thankful for their investment because their employees' families, the towns in which they live in are going to reap the benefit.
So as we wrap up and you think about the whole of what you get to see with people who are doing who-based development, what are some of your overriding thoughts of what you get to see day in and day out with leaders and organizations that are pursuing who-based development?
As I just thought about key aspects of the journey that have seemed to be really important to our clients, there's another phrase we say a lot, and it's awareness is progress. And I think as I've seen clients engage with each of these new concepts of being others focused and inwardly sound, as they're putting in the time, as they're engaging with their small groups and they're reflecting and mining these deep ideas and concepts, that every time they step into a little bit more awareness, they are moving forward. And sometimes we're tiptoeing and sometimes we're taking these giant leaps. But one of the things we encourage them with that they have repeated back to us that has been very powerful is awareness is progress. So every time I spend those moments reflecting and I'm gaining more self-awareness and I'm seeing myself and I'm willing to look at these things, that they're becoming more well-developed human beings. They're becoming what we call these well-developed who's, and it's having this ripple effect in their lives. And that's been pretty powerful.
Well, thank you for doing this episode here on the summer series. And thank you for giving people who are listening a chance to see behind the curtain on what you get to see all the time.
Thanks for inviting me on, and just thankful to the people who have partnered with us in this work because I feel truly honored to get to be a part of their journey.
So let's take a quick look on a couple of things that Sara said. Let's start with something that she said towards the end of the discussion when she talked about awareness is progress. Now, I know the objection to this statement. The objection to the statement goes something like this. Well, if all I ever do is become aware, then I never actually grow, I never actually develop, I never actually improve. I'm just aware that I'm substandard, or maybe I'm very good, but I haven't reached my potential. I'm aware of that, but that doesn't really mean anything if people don't do anything. And I see the logic in that argument. However, here's what practical experience has shown me. It is unbelievably rare that people become aware and then do absolutely nothing about it. There is routinely a great deal of motivation for leaders to grow and improve once the awareness light comes on. Now, do they do that perfectly? Do they do that as fast as others might want them to? Not necessarily. But here's the thing. We have to recognize in our development when we start to notice things about ourselves that we didn't see before, even when it's failure. What do I mean by that? Let's take the issue of curiosity, for example. If I begin to notice how infrequently I am curious with others, how infrequently I'm asking questions with a true openness to learn. If I begin to notice that is clearly an improvement over doing those things and having no idea that I'm doing them. In almost every aspect of growing and developing as a leader, especially in the space of who we are as we try to become more inwardly sound and others focused, in almost every instance, the first step is to first become aware of what's going on. We understand what the current status is in who we are and how that is showing up to impact our leadership and impact those we are leading. So awareness is, in fact, progress because it shows that our antennas are being raised, that we're beginning to see and understand the things that other people are experiencing from us on a regular basis. And that is the very critical first step towards growth and development. So in my experience of watching leaders walk this path, the who-based development path, I will repeat myself, it is unbelievably rare that leaders would come to a great level of awareness about where they are and choose not to take steps forward to improve. It is so rare that we say without hesitation, again what Sara said, awareness is progress. The second thing I want to point out is what Sara shared with us around the possibilities of success in who-based leadership development. If we're working on the core of who we are, what is it that is so necessary for individuals and organizations to understand, to show up and bring to the table? And you heard it from Sara. She talked about commitment, a willingness to put in the work, a willingness to have the discipline around a variety of activities, especially around the issue of reflection. I mean, the world is such a busy and loud place. It takes tremendous discipline to pause and reflect on a regular basis. But the key isn't having the perfect journaling process or thinking process around your reflection. I mean, those are helpful. But what's most important is the commitment to do it, the willingness to not schedule over that 10 minutes. The idea that the urgent things of the business are going to come knocking. They are going to tempt us to not follow through on our curious practice for the day or our principled practice for the day or journaling and reflection, those various things where we pause ourselves so that we can step back from the reality of the moment and learn. Those temptations to overrun those one-person meetings with ourselves, those are going to come fast and they are going to be strong. But if we can commit ourselves, if we have a deep willingness to grow and develop around these issues, that is perhaps the most important key to making progress. So this idea of, am I willing, really, when it comes down to it, am I willing to set aside the time? Am I willing to discipline myself so that I have an opportunity to truly grow and develop from the core of who I am as a human being so that I can be the very best leader I'm capable of being? And because of those reasons, it requires a deep and valuable commitment. It requires a sincere willingness. And so that leads me to the question I want to leave you with, not only for today's episode, but to wrap up this entire summer series, Who Not What, From Research to Application. And that question is this: are you willing to commit? Are you willing to commit to the difficult path of developing who you are so that you can reach your potential as a leader, not only for your benefit, but for the benefit of every person you lead and influence? This is Tim Spiker, reminding you to be worth following. And be sure to follow us wherever you engage with podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your colleagues and friends. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.